In 1893, while millions of visitors flocked to Chicago for the World's Fair, a well-dressed doctor was quietly running a hotel just blocks away. One built with secret passages, soundproofed rooms, and a chute leading straight to the basement. Guests checked in. Most never checked out. This is the story of H.H. Holmes, America's first known serial killer. Welcome back to Umair X. If you haven't seen our video on Jack the Ripper, go check that one out next. Now, let's get into this one. Herman Webster Mudgett, the man who would later become known to the world as H.H. Holmes, was born in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, in 1861, into a strict, religious household that friends and biographers later described as emotionally cold, with a father who was reportedly harsh and often absent. From an early age, those who knew him described him as intelligent, manipulative, and unusually skilled at gaining people's trust, traits that would come to define both his professional success and the horrors he would eventually be responsible for. Even as a child, according to accounts collected later by biographers, Holmes reportedly showed an early and unsettling fascination with human anatomy, allegedly performing informal dissections on animals, a detail that, whether entirely accurate or embellished in hindsight, has become part of the broader narrative historians have constructed around his early development. He attended the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, graduating in 1884, and it was during this period that Holmes reportedly began experimenting with an early version of the fraud schemes that would define much of his adult life. According to later investigations, he would steal cadavers from the school's laboratory, disfigure them using acid or other means to make identification difficult, and then use the bodies to fraudulently stage accidental deaths, allowing him to collect life insurance payouts on policies he had taken out under invented identities. It was a scheme built on a combination of medical knowledge, patience, and a complete absence of the discomfort most people would feel at the idea of manipulating human remains for profit, three traits that would remain constant throughout the rest of his life, growing only more elaborate and more dangerous over time. By the mid-1880s, Holmes had relocated to Chicago, adopting the alias under which he would eventually become infamous, and began working at a local pharmacy located in the Englewood neighborhood on the city's south side. Owned by a widow named Elizabeth Holton, Holmes proved himself an able and charming employee, and when the pharmacy's owner, Dr. Holton, died under circumstances that were, at the time, simply attributed to cancer and never formally investigated for any possible connection to Holmes, Holmes convinced the widow to sell him the business, eventually acquiring full ownership, a pattern of insinuating himself into positions of trust and then quietly maneuvering to take control that he would repeat, with escalating consequences, throughout the rest of his career. Soon after taking over the pharmacy, Holmes purchased an empty lot directly across the street and began construction on a massive three-story building that would eventually become known, once the full scope of what happened inside it came to light, as the Murder Castle. Construction began around 1887 and continued with numerous changes and additions for several years, funded substantially through additional insurance fraud, business loans he had little intention of repaying, and money extracted from investors and business partners he had convinced to trust him. The building was, on its surface, an unremarkable commercial property, with retail shops occupying the ground floor, including, eventually, Holmes's own relocated pharmacy. But the upper floors, which Holmes designed and constantly redesigned throughout construction, deliberately hiring and firing different construction crews in overlapping shifts so that no single worker ever fully understood the building's complete layout, contained dozens of small, windowless rooms, doors that opened onto solid brick walls, staircases that led to nowhere or ended abruptly at ceilings, and hidden passages connecting rooms that, from any conventional interior perspective, appeared to have no logical connection to one another at all. This deliberately disorienting design, historians and criminologists who have studied the case have since argued, served a specific and calculated purpose. By ensuring that no single contractor, worker, or outside observer ever understood the building's true internal structure, Holmes was able to construct hidden features, including secret passages, trapdoors, and sealed rooms, without any individual worker possessing enough knowledge of the overall design to recognize or report anything unusual about what they were building. With the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition drawing an estimated 27 million visitors to Chicago over the course of the fair, an almost unimaginable influx of tourists job seekers, and new arrivals to a city already growing rapidly. Holmes converted much of the building into a hotel, advertising affordable rooms specifically to the young women, out-of-town visitors, and job seekers flooding into the city during this period, many of whom, being unfamiliar with Chicago and often traveling without close family connections nearby, made for victims whose sudden disappearance was far less likely to be immediately noticed or investigated than might otherwise have been the case. Many of Holmes's documented and suspected victims were young women, some employed directly by Holmes himself in various capacities connected to his business ventures, others simply guests who had checked into his hotel during the fair, drawn in by his charm, his professional respectability as a licensed physician, and the simple, practical appeal of an affordable place to stay during a period when Chicago's hotels were stretched thin by the sheer volume of visitors the fair had brought to the city. Investigators who later examined the building, once the full scope of Holmes's activities finally came to light, found physical features that confirmed much of what would eventually be reconstructed about how he operated. Chutes led from certain upper-floor rooms directly down to the basement, allowing bodies to be moved quickly and discreetly without needing to be carried through any of the building's more visible common areas. Several rooms appear to have been specifically fitted with gas lines connected to a control mechanism accessible only from outside the room itself, allowing Holmes to potentially incapacitate or asphyxiate an occupant without the individual having any ability to escape or seek help, a detail that, if accurate as later reconstructed by investigators, suggests a chilling level of premeditated design built directly into the building's original construction. In the basement, investigators discovered evidence of what appeared to be a dissection table, along with a large furnace and various acid vats that Holmes had apparently used to dispose of remains, dissolving or incinerating evidence in a manner consistent with both destroying evidence of murder and, in at least some documented instances, preparing skeletal remains that Holmes then sold to medical schools and anatomical suppliers, a grim and calculated continuation of the same fraudulent medical trade he had first begun experimenting with as a student years earlier, now applied on a considerably larger and more directly murderous scale. For several years throughout the late 1880s and into the early 1890s, Holmes operated with remarkably little outside scrutiny, protected substantially by his own professional respectability as a licensed physician and successful local businessman, his considerable personal charm, which by numerous later accounts made him unusually persuasive and trustworthy in the eyes of nearly everyone he interacted with, and the simple, grim reality that many of his victims, being young, often single women, who had recently arrived in Chicago from elsewhere, lacked the kind of established local social or family network that might otherwise have raised an alarm and prompted investigation when they suddenly stopped communicating with people back home. Holmes's crimes eventually began unraveling not directly because of any of the Chicago victims connected to his hotel, but through an entirely separate and, in some ways, more mundane insurance fraud scheme involving a former business associate and longtime accomplice named Benjamin Pitzel. Holmes and Pitzel had worked together on various fraudulent schemes for years, and in 1894, the two devised a plan in which Pitzel would fake his own death, allowing Holmes to help his family collect a substantial life insurance payout, which the two men would then split between them. In carrying out this scheme, however, Holmes murdered Pitzel for real, staging the death to appear consistent with the accident the two men had originally planned to fake, and then proceeded to manipulate Pitzel's grieving widow, convincing her to entrust him with 3 of her children under the pretense of reuniting the family with Pitzel, who she still believed to be alive and hiding as part of the ongoing insurance fraud. Holmes then murdered all 3 children as well, over the following weeks, as he moved with them across several different states, a chilling escalation from his earlier pattern of victims connected to his Chicago hotel, and one that would ultimately prove to be his undoing. Suspicious of inconsistencies in the insurance claim, investigators began digging into the circumstances surrounding Pitzel's death, eventually uncovering evidence connecting Holmes not only to Pitzel's murder, but to the disappearance of his 3 children as well. This investigation rapidly expanded into a much broader inquiry into Holmes's background and activities, eventually leading detectives back to the Chicago building and the horrors that had, for years, remained concealed within its walls. Holmes was arrested in November of 1894, And as investigators continued piecing together the full scope of his activities over the following months, the case exploded into one of the most sensationalized criminal investigations in the country's history, drawing extensive newspaper coverage that dramatized many aspects of the building's construction and Holmes's alleged methods, some of which, historians have since noted, likely involved a degree of journalistic embellishment layered on top of the genuinely disturbing facts investigators were able to confirm, making it, even now, occasionally difficult for historians to fully separate documented, verified details of the case from popular exaggerations that emerged during the extensive contemporary press coverage. Holmes ultimately confessed to 27 murders in a detailed account published shortly before his execution, though he also recanted portions of that confession at various points, at one point claiming a considerably lower number of actual victims, and investigators were only able to conclusively confirm a smaller number of deaths through available physical evidence, largely due to how thoroughly Holmes had disposed of remains through dissolution, incineration, and sale to medical suppliers. Some historians and researchers who have studied the case in the decades since believe the true number of people who died at his hands may have been considerably higher than even his own confessed total, given how many missing persons cases from the period, involving young women who had recently and often anonymously arrived in Chicago during the fair, were never definitively connected to Holmes at all, and likely never will be, given how much time has passed and how much of the original physical evidence was destroyed. If you're enjoying this one, go ahead and subscribe. More stories like this every week. Holmes was tried specifically for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel, the case for which investigators possessed the clearest and most direct physical evidence, and was convicted following a trial that drew substantial public attention given the broader, considerably more extensive allegations connected to his Chicago hotel that had already been widely reported by that point. He was sentenced to death and executed by hanging on May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. Even in his final days and hours, Holmes continued shifting and contradicting his own account of events, at one point claiming, contrary to his earlier detailed written confession, that he had killed no one at all, and at another point suggesting, in comments reported by witnesses present at his execution, that he could feel himself physically transforming into a figure resembling the devil, a statement that, along with his well-documented lifelong pattern of calculated manipulation and deception, has left historians divided over how much of anything Holmes ever said, including his own confessions of guilt, can be considered a reliable account of what he actually did. The murder castle itself burned down under circumstances that were, at the time, considered suspicious in August of 1895, while Holmes was still awaiting trial, destroying much of the remaining physical evidence within the building that investigators had not yet fully documented or removed, a loss that has permanently limited historians' and researchers' ability to definitively confirm the full scope of what actually occurred inside the building during the years Holmes operated it. The building's foundation was later incorporated into a subsequent structure built on the same site, which itself was eventually demolished, meaning that today, nothing of the original murder castle remains visible at the location, though the site continues to draw considerable interest from historians, true crime researchers, and curious visitors, more than a century after Holmes's execution. What remains, in the absence of the physical building itself and much of the original evidence it once contained, is a case built substantially from Holmes's own contradictory partial confessions, fragmented surviving physical evidence, extensive but not entirely reliable contemporary newspaper coverage, and the broader historical reconstruction that generations of subsequent researchers have worked to piece together from these often incomplete and sometimes conflicting sources. Holmes himself, a man who lied so consistently and so convincingly throughout the entirety of his adult life, remains, even in his own recorded confessions, someone whose actual words can never be fully or confidently trusted, a final, fitting irony for a case defined from beginning to end by deception. More than a century after his execution, H. Holmes is remembered as America's first documented serial killer, a distinction that reflects both the scale and premeditated nature of his crimes and the specific, deliberate way he constructed an entire building, quite literally, around the business of murder. exploiting the anonymity and chaos of one of the largest public events in American history to draw victims whose disappearances went largely unnoticed and uninvestigated for years. He very nearly got away with all of it, undone in the end not by anyone connecting the pattern of missing hotel guests to their killer, but by an entirely separate, almost incidental piece of insurance fraud that happened to unravel at exactly the wrong moment for a man who had, up until that point, spent years building an increasingly elaborate architecture of deception, both literal and otherwise, specifically designed to ensure that it never would. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to Umair X for more true crime and dark history. And don't forget to check out the Jack the Ripper video if you haven't already. Look deeper. Know more.